Hello, I'm Dawn Durham, and this is PaTTANpod. Today, we are talking about the complexities of teaching reading. In discussing those complexities, we also want to look at how teachers are prepared to teach reading. What knowledge and skill sets do we need to teach a child how to read? Joining me today is Dr. Louisa Moats. Dr. Moats, thank you for taking time to share your knowledge and insights with us around this topic. I know that you work tirelessly to ensure that educators understand how complex reading really is.
Well, that has been my major focus, especially for the last 20 or 25 years. Thank you.
Well, we're excited to have you with us, and we know that you'll give us some good insight and some good guidance as to where we go from here on out in regards to advancing our own professional knowledge. But I want to start right away with, you have been known to say that teaching reading is rocket science. Why would you refer to it in such a way?
Well, I refer to it as rocket science because at the time I wrote that paper for the American Federation of Teachers, which was 1999, it struck me that there was an enormous gulf between what I was learning as a scientist, as a, at that time, a Co-Principal Investigator on a major research project funded by the National Institutes of Health, which had forced me really to learn the science of reading and to get to know the major research enterprises that were ongoing in the United States and abroad. And it struck me that as I was working in the schools in Washington at the time, that most teachers had no inkling of the information that was guiding our efforts in the research community. And I had to begin to contemplate, as I have been contemplating really since 1994 when I wrote the first paper about this, why it is that there's such a gulf between science and practice, which actually continues today. And it struck me that one major reason why this condition persists and why it existed at the time was that understanding reading requires quite a knowledge base on the part of teachers and educators. It's not easy to understand. Reading is a very complicated and ever-shifting psychological process. And a lot of what goes on in our brains as we learn to read is hidden from view. So that's one factor. Reading itself is complex and difficult to understand. And the other side of that is that teaching well and teaching children in a way that really targets what is going on with them and what their needs really are is challenging and difficult. And as I watched good teachers and not so good teachers at work, it struck me that the ones who were really capable of ensuring that all of the kids in their classes were learning how to read not only knew a lot consciously and unconsciously, but also had an enormous repertoire of skills that they would employ as needed to select examples, to give corrective feedback to students, to decide when to press students on something difficult and when to let go. They had to decide what to do next always. And at the time I read an article, I think by someone who studies teacher decision making, that suggested that a really tuned in and competent teacher makes something like 200 decisions per hour. So all that was going on in my head at the time. And simultaneously, the work of the National Reading Panel was ongoing between 1998 and the year 2000, when the National Reading Panel report was published. And I sat in on some of those meetings that were taking place in Washington and listened to this panel of eminent people, 15 of them, review evidence as they were analyzing, doing a meta-analysis of the vast literature that existed at the time on learning to read and reading instruction. So all that together added up to that idea that teaching reading is rocket science. And I cannot take credit for the title of the paper that I did write. It was Marcia Berger, who was managing literacy enterprises at the American Federation of Teachers, who actually came up with that title based on what I had written for the monograph at that time. And then the scientist who presented the National Reading Panel findings in the year 2000 to a congressional subcommittee opened his remarks by saying, you know, teaching is rocket science, and I know because I'm a rocket scientist. So I think that helped that saying to stick.
Well, the term rocket science is certainly very accurate, right? I mean, there's so many pieces and parts that play into being able to pull print off the page and then being able to do something with that print. So I think, although it wasn't necessarily your catchphrase, if you will, it certainly did stick, and it stuck because it is very accurate and makes sense with when we think about the complexities of reading. Absolutely. I want to take a look here. You know, you talk about this gulf between research and practice, and I have some articles here that you have written. The Missing Foundation in Teacher Education in 1995. Wanted, Teachers with Knowledge of Language, 1996. Still wanted, Teachers with Knowledge of Language, 2009. It's not as if we haven't made this a public service announcement, if you will, that teachers need to have a knowledge of the structure of our language, the knowledge of multiple layers of our language, and yet, you know, we still have this idea of practice and research not matching up. And so because of that, I want to pivot to the IDA, the International Dyslexia Association Knowledge and Practice Standards. We have these standards that are evidence-based details on what a teacher, what a practitioner, whether it be a classroom teacher, interventionist, a specialist, special educator, instructional leader, what a practitioner should know about the structure of our language and how that knowledge would look or how it would apply in a classroom setting. So I want to ask you, do you think the field, the practitioners out there, the majority of them are aware that these standards exist and their purpose of what these standards are?
I think awareness needs to grow and develop for sure. Not too many people are aware, and it will take time for those standards to take hold. Any set of standards that's new has to compete with the existing ones by which university departments have had to organize their offerings for the past several decades. So this is kind of the rebel initiative by the IDA. But the reason that I've worked on this other set of standards, which I think are the best ones, the most explicit ones, the ones that directly and in detail tie the standards to what we expect in practice, is that existing sets of standards are not specific enough. They're not focused on the right things. And they don't have the depth that really provides guidance for course instructors and for teachers who are aspiring to truly be equipped to go into a classroom, recognize reading and language difficulties, and then really do something about it no matter what role they're playing in the classroom. The present set of standards, and I'm so glad you asked me about this, but the present set of standards is a revision of ones we generated in the year 2010. And this set of revised standards, I'm very pleased to say, is the culmination of input from very eminent people. I cannot claim that I am personally responsible for the excellence of these standards. Rather, I know enough to know what I don't know and to tap the shoulders of my colleagues who are really capable of explaining and articulating uh, what teaching reading is all about. So I hope that there will be increasing attention to these standards. Even in 2010, when we developed the standards the first time, many professors in universities wrote to me and said, well, we're not able to actually follow through with the requirement that people meet these standards yet, but they're really great. And so we applaud what you all have done. And it will be a while before we can act on yet another set of standards because we have so many others to comply with, but you all have done a great job putting these together. So that was some solace for me. And I recognize that it takes a long time and it will be always a work in progress.
I think you're right. Anytime that we implement new standards or really any new innovation, it does take time to kind of get buy-in from everyone, to make sure that everyone sees that there's value here in what these standards are showing and expressing, and then being able to kind of take that and internalize those standards to do something with them. And let's expand on these standards a little bit more. For those practitioners or instructional leaders that are out there listening to this podcast, how should they look at these standards? How should they view them and say, okay, is this my professional development plan? Do I look at these individually by standards? Where is my team at? Where is my team needing some work? How should instructional leaders and practitioners really look at these standards in order to guide them to become more proficient literacy instructors for their students?
Great question. Well, I would say, first of all, take the time to read the whole document, because not only do we specify standards and what the application looks like in a classroom, but also we have a narrative explanation. And a lot of that was written by Louisa C. And we have extensive reference lists to support the content of the standards. So we're not pulling these things out of the air, and we're not putting things in the standards that sound nice or that are going to placate people who hold a certain philosophy about teaching reading. We're not trying to please everybody. We're trying to align what we're asking teachers to do with an evidence base, a scientific evidence base. So that's the first thing. And then translating these, well, the IDA in October will be publishing handbooks to guide actual teacher certification that's in line with these standards, and an accreditation process for institutions that want to be authorized or certified institutionally to carry out the certification process for teachers. I'm sorry, I'm not using the right words here, but
no, that's great.
Accreditation, certification guidelines will be posted on October 1st. And the person who's leading this initiative is Jewel McComb-Tolis from Connecticut. And she has been piloting the standards document as a guiding framework in her college, in Fairfield University in Connecticut, over this past year, to make sure that the certification and accreditation processes are realistic and doable, and the time frame makes sense, and so on. So that's one thing people can do, is just be very familiar with those guiding documents. And then the next thing is, well, if I could put in a plug for letters, which PaTTAN has been widely committed to for years now, for which I'm very grateful, and for which I admire all of you for your consistency and your commitment to educating teachers statewide. But what's required with letters, which of course is as aligned with the IDA standards as I could make it for regular classroom teachers primarily, and as background for any specialists or interventionists. Um, uh, Learning the content and everything that is enumerated in the standards and learning how to apply that content is a long-term process. What doesn't work is a set of quick and dirty workshops, or the 2-hour overview, or the even 1-day overview. That kind of professional development is a waste of time. Because getting back to the original point, if teaching reading is rocket science, or if it is indeed complex and requires a rather deep knowledge base on the part of the teacher, and that means the knowledge of how kids learn to read, what accounts for individual differences, the structure of language and the content that one teaches during reading instruction, and then the ins and outs of pedagogy, all of that requires a methodical, incremental, continuous learning process. And for many of us who've been doing this all our lives, we view ourselves as learners who continue to deepen our knowledge and refine our practices, and that learning process never ends. We have designed letters so that it takes 2 years to go through the basic information. The first year focused on foundational skills of teaching kids how to read the words and develop some fluency and automaticity in reading the words. And then the whole second year on vocabulary and language comprehension as it is exercised through reading and writing. So my first piece of advice is take the long view. Bite off as much as you can, as long as you can do that piece really thoroughly and with sufficient depth to allow teachers to truly understand what they're doing and apply successfully different and new techniques. The other part of this, and the reason that it takes a while, is that not only is the information complicated, sorry to say, but learnable and exciting to learn. But changing our practices is hard. And teachers, understandably, are stressed and busy. And what are you going to do when you go into the class every day? You're going to do what you already know how to do, right? And changing and trying new things and shifting your whole approach, which is required in many instances, is difficult. It involves letting go of things that you thought were kind of cool or fun or whatever, or sounded good or looked good, and replacing those things with approaches and tools and activities and learning and direct instruction that is going to be more efficacious for more kids. So all of that is asking a lot.
I want to circle back to a couple of things you said here. You talked about the accreditation of these IDA knowledge and practice standards for institutes of higher education. And I have to tell you that across PaTTAN, we look to provide professional development to all areas in the field, not just in literacy, but in all areas. And our uptick in need for professional development in the field of literacy, particularly in those foundational skills, certainly dictates a need for the institutes of higher education to take a look at how they're preparing pre-service teachers to enter a classroom. And if we kind of dug in right there at those institutes and how we're preparing pre-service teachers, we might have a heads up before these folks walk into a classroom and potentially do some instructional casualties there. So I'm really happy to see that as a field we're moving in that direction, looking at teacher education specifically. I also want to talk about, you mentioned letters. So I want to just make sure that everyone understands what that is. LETTER stands for Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling. And it's not a program where on day one you start on page 1 and you get to page 300 by the end of the year. It is professional development knowledge. It's information that you as a practitioner, whether you're a classroom teacher, interventionist, special education teacher, instructional leader, that we as practitioners need to understand about the language structure of English, about the multiple layers of language, and how we can best instruct students how to read. The information helps us to not only know how to instruct students, but how to identify when a student is struggling, how to intervene when that student is struggling, and then understanding why a student may be struggling. So I do encourage you to seek out letters trainings across the state here at PaTTAN, in all 3 regional offices, in the Central region in Harrisburg, in the East region, Malvern, and in the West in Pittsburgh. Do check out their training calendars to see what is available for letters trainings across the state. Our intermediate units, our IUs, are also holding lots and lots of letters training, so do seek those out. It will be knowledge and time that is well afforded to take you to the next level, and that is advancing evidence into practice. And we talk so much, Dr. Moats, about how we want to see this research into practice, and that's a hard thing. As you had said, you have to think of this as a long-term view. You have to think of this as a long-term project. A goal of ours is to ensure that that evidence of what we know for the past 30, 40 years, what we know as good literacy instruction, is being applied into the classroom in our setting. So I'm thrilled that we were able to talk about that, and thank you for making sure that we mentioned letters, because that's something that our listeners need to be thinking about. We talk about the complexities of reading as we shared here today, and it really dictates for us that teachers have to have a solid grasp on the structure of our language. And when we ourselves understand, then we're better prepared to teach students. Many of us, unfortunately, as we had said, did not receive this information or knowledge when we were in our pre-service education programs ourselves. So that does require us to go and seek out this information in order to build our own skills on how to teach reading. And Dr. Moats, I thank you so much for being with us today. You did share a small piece of advice in regards to where you think teachers should really be thinking about that long-term view. Do you have any, at PaTTAN, we strive so hard to ensure that we are providing professional growth. We want practitioners across the state to grow in their professional manner. Do you have any other words of advice for us on how to help teachers across the field grow professionally?
I think it's important to have colleagues, to have a professional learning community in which readings are shared and discussed, in which videos are viewed and critiqued, and to the extent that people can work as teams and watch each other teach, that's a very good practice. I think adopting an attitude that teaching reading is complex, it is rocket science, it is a lifelong enterprise. To understand what goes on with students and to understand individual differences. I think humility is important. I think commitment and a sense of responsibility for all students is something that we as educators must retain as our primary mission, so that when we come across difficult problems, and this is something, of course, we face a lot. Schools where reading failure is endemic, and you want to sort of throw up your hands and say, "This is too big a knot for me to untie," to quote Shakespeare. We have no choice but to forge ahead and continue to try to do better, because the social costs of reading failure are enormous. And when we know so much, especially about early identification, early intervention, the power of regular classroom instruction when we're doing the right stuff, and the long-term benefits of doing what kids need, aligned with science, there is no more important role to undertake for us as professionals. With all of the problems we have in our profession, that sense of mission should be something that drives all of us to continue swimming upstream if we have to, or and enjoying the significance of our successes. And so I would like to say again, I am very thankful for all of the efforts that have gone on in Pennsylvania now for a number of years, and all the people who are out there working with teachers, all the letters trainers, and just PaTTAN as a state level leadership entity. I like to cite you as exceptionally credible and efficacious among the many states who are looking for models for how to carry out the work. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll represent PaTTAN here when I say we so very much appreciate that, and we do strive to create a field that does exactly as you say, change the trajectory for students, particularly in the field of literacy, as that's my area of expertise, but across the board, behavior, autism, traumatic brain injury. You know, we work to change the trajectory for all of our students. So I'm so thrilled to hear you say that, and I will be sure to share that with the colleagues across the state of your kind words. But thank you so much for being here with us today. We truly appreciate Dr. Moats. Thank you to everyone in the field who you truly inspire educational growth within your students every day. And a special thank you to John Ragsdale, who produces PaTTAnpod. See you next time.